Welcome to Fine Cuisine and Etiquette with your host, Oliver Gerald the Eater, your guide to the finer things in life. And welcome to my highly requested, highly educational, and highly modest history of food, grub, cuisine, victuals, chow, and every other synonym you could possibly conceive from your decidedly unprivileged lot in life. At the birthplace of civilization, when humans had only recently evolved from apes or were poofed into existence, depending on how right or wrong you are, our species were hunter-gatherers. So the males of the species spent their time hunting for prehistoric poontang and occasionally gathering some berries and small animals so their family unit would hopefully survive to the ripe old age of 28. Course, even then, the humans of the Eurasia continent had longer lifespans, better healthcare, and better pointy sticks than the chimps occupying the northern Mesoamerica continent. And so our primitive ancestors established a halfway organized civilization based on the males collecting berries that hopefully didn't poison everyone, and despite having just evolved from primates, the females still nagged the males about cutting the grass, doing their taxes, and not dipping their wick in anything that moves. Coincidentally, marital counseling began in year 2 of recorded history, when our fairy forebears, tired of their explosive bowel movements caused by diets that were 85% fiber, they tried trapping small animals. Unfortunately, the humans of that era smelled like a mix of rotten fruit and New York City, and animals could smell them from 10 kilometers away. It was at that point that early Homo sapiens stumbled on a part of their lake that was upstream of their own shit and downstream of Dr. Fleming's Hollywood liposuction clinic, and they discovered that rendered fat can make for an effective soap. With their newfound olfactory enhancement in place, they were able to get the drop on animals and their protein-laden meat. And so began man's reign atop the food chain, and with a fresh supply of protein, humans went from this to this, virtually overnight. It wasn't long before your average man got too preoccupied looking at his pecs and penis and shiny rocks to do any real hunting or gathering. So he started paying people to deliver his food for him. And so began the first takeout restaurants and the establishment of the peasant class. Because, let's face it, no one with money is doing anyone else's bitch work. The takeout business became so lucrative that prehistoric ventures began competing with each other in increasingly cutthroat advertisements and promotions. One establishment that specialized in flatbread with gravy promised delivery in 30 minutes or less, which led to the very first vehicles. This in turn led to the very first insurance companies, the very first government regulations, and the very first lawyers. So basically humanity itself at least 100,000 years before Sgt. Pepper. Eventually, the takeout business saturated the market, and early Cro-Magnons took up agriculture. One day, whilst doing his morning glory at the hole, Gerald the Mighty discovered that plants were blooming near his own human fertilizer. Thoroughly confused, Gerald tried consuming his own feces, and after an E. coli outbreak wiped out 40% of all humanity, the survivors realized it was the plants, not the fertilizer, that was the figurative cash crop. So once they figured out that life changer, they chanced upon another important discovery. On an especially hot day, they happened to inhale the vapors from the sativa cannabis. And after getting baked out of their minds and not noticing when 5 of them expired from heat stroke, one of them immediately wrote the lyrics to the Curtis Mayfield classic Pusher Man, and the rest is history. And then for thousands of years, nothing important happened, while the unwashed masses smelled like shit and leased off the aristocracy, and the females of the species were just as hairy as the men, and they hadn't yet discovered genteel inventions like corsets and lead-based cosmetics. Nor did they contract tuberculosis on purpose, consume arsenic to bleach their skin, use belladonna to dilate their pupils, swallow tapeworms, or shave their legs. But through the arsenic, the hairy legs, and the stench so foul it melts my nose hairs, the one constant other than a stench is that peasants got shoved up from cosplaying as John Deere. Thousands of years before Orville Redenbacher made popcorn gangster, the humble kernel was a staple of the proletariat, and barley, wheat, oats, and rye were as regular as morning wood. All that time outdoors not only made the commoners smell like an Irish wedding, but it made them easy to tell apart from the aristocracy by the farmer's eponymous tan and the noble's nearly translucent skin. Like today, peasants mostly subsisted on cheap crap that ensured they would offend the upper class's nasal cavities for more than a few decades tops. More likely, they'd exit the mortal coil early, weighing 14 stone and with the same cardiovascular health as peasants from the southern colonies who live on a diet of cornbread, grits, and chicken fried steak. By the time of the ancient Greeks, man was used to the kind of short, pathetic life that only peasants can fully appreciate. So they drowned their sorrows with wine. Lots and lots of wine. While Pericles, Aristotle, and Plato were establishing the foundations of mathematics, philosophy, and democracy, the commoners were getting thoroughly shit-faced and making bad decisions like taking out student loans and investing in crypto. Meals for the ancient Greeks were rather similar to the present day. They'd wake up from their nightly bender with a splitting headache and a burning desire for fine gentlemen like Jack Daniels and Jim Beam. Failing that, they'd have a rather humble breakfast of bread, usually dipped in wine. A Mediterranean lunch could include cheese, olives, figs, more bread dipped in wine, and depending on your station in life, either fresh or salted fish. Dinner was more of the same, with potentially legumes, asparagus, or eggs thrown in for variety. And always wine, from sunup to sundown, kegger to Bach social, and toga. If there was one thing the Greeks knew, it was how to get properly pissed off their asses. And if they weren't fighting off androgynous Persians or sculpting their washboard abs, they were getting more plastered than I was at my daughter's dance recital. The next link in the genesis of human democratic tradition occurred on the Italian peninsula. And like the Greeks, the Romans enjoyed a good debate, a good and good food. But really, what did the Romans ever do for Western civilization? Well, other than sanitation, medicine, education, wine, public order, irrigation, roads, the freshwater system, and public health, not much. When the Romans weren't having giant orgies, using communal sponges to wipe themselves, or persecuting the People's Front of Judea, they generally partook in up to 4 daily meals. There was ientaculum, their version of breakfast, served first thing in the morning. A small lunch, prandium, would occur at about 11 a.m., and cena, which, like the American dinner, was the main meal of the day. And for the cena, which could last several hours, diners sat in the triclinium, or the dining room, and they sometimes added a late supper called vesperna. As for the food itself, they'd have fish, vegetables, eggs, cheese, grains, legumes, and meat. But for the latter, beef was rare and reserved for the wealthy. Instead, they feasted on dormice, hare, snails, and boar, and birds like thrushes, chickens, and pheasants. Somewhere in there's a joke about pheasants for peasants, but I'm too lazy. Romans grew beans, olives, peas, onions, and brassicas, and since their empire eventually encompassed about 20% of the world's population, new fruits and vegetables were added to the menu via conquest. The Roman citizenry ate almost as well as the lions, who had a veritable buffet of Christians to feast on. And speaking of which, Christianity was originally founded upon the altar of rye bread. And like the Greeks and Romans, the rye bread fan club loved getting shit-faced on an assortment of wines, so they founded a religion and made up some bullshit about the body and blood of their savior. Though today, younger heretics destroy the original meaning of the fan club by substituting wine for grape juice. Once the Western Roman Empire fell around about 476 Anno Domini as a direct result of a popular play by William Shakespeare and some upstanding citizen named Marcus Junius Brutus, once that happened, the Europeans immediately began getting their rocks off to chainmail, plagues, and religious persecution, and thus began the Middle Ages. During medieval times, our understanding of human physiology was about as proficient as females at mathematics, and we labored under the belief that raw fruits and vegetables caused disease, so they were all cooked. And like most periods in history, the diet of the nobility differed greatly from that of the dirty, filthy peasants. For the more privileged, important members of society, they had access to fresh meat and river fish, plus exotic game like peacocks, seals, porpoises, and even whales. The wealthy utilized expensive spices like caraway, nutmeg, cardamom, ginger, and pepper, and if you really wanted to flaunt your fortune, you'd feature sugar sculptures known as solitaires that were fashioned to resemble castles, ships, famous philosophers, or scenes from fables. On the other hand, the unwashed masses had to settle for pork over meat or fish, and because they kept cows but couldn't afford to slaughter them for their beef, they had ready access to buttermilk, cheese, or curds and whey. Rich and poor both had an abundance of bread of varying quality, and they each had something called pottage, which was a thick soup containing meat, vegetables, or bran. Otherwise, the wealthy in the Middle Ages were basically living an entirely different existence than the illiterate, ill-mannered, and ill-fated peasantry. One enjoyed lavish feasts with the finest meats, spices, and desserts from around the world, and the others spent their days stinking up their tiny, filthy hovels while waiting to see whether war, plague, or malnutrition would take them first. It was also during this period that pretzels first appeared. Round about 610 AD, Italian monks invented them as a way to reward children who memorized their prayers, and the pretzels were shaped as such. And while they've evolved rather dramatically over the last 1500 years, pretzels still retain some of their original religious significance, especially in parts of Europe. Prior to settlers arriving in the New World, the natives of the North American continent had thousands of years to establish a unique culture and dietary habits that were in tune with nature and their particular geographic area. And then colonials arrived, and like Americans, or soon-to-be Americans, have done for time immemorial, they took a giant steaming on older, more sophisticated cultures and substituted their own arrogance. Before the colonials made contact with these so-called Native Americans, the latter's cuisine was largely determined by their surroundings. Natives of the Great Plains relied on bison for their hides and their meat, and pretty much every part of these large mammals. While natives of the coast enjoyed a fair amount of seafood, and anywhere near wooded areas hunted deer, bear, antelope, turkey, and an assortment of smaller game. And while these indigenous peoples cultivated a wide variety of crops, corn, beans, and squash formed the so-called Three Sisters, the major staples of Native American agriculture. Especially corn, which wasn't eaten on the cob like today, but it was ground into flour for tortillas, cornbreads, and corn mush. They also used cornmeal, salt, and water, and sometimes sugar and fat, to make Johnny cakes, which remains popular through the present. Corn also may have helped the early pilgrims stave off starvation. Like Americans today, the early colonials showed up with a lot of noise and arrogance, proceeded to f up everything they touched, including their own crops, and if the natives hadn't shown them how to grow corn, these proto-Americans might have died off. But they didn't. Thank God. And the pilgrims repaid the natives for their kindness with unending friendship and goodwill, and they always respected the natives' culture, traditions, and territorial integrity. But the colonials' arrival didn't just set in motion the inevitable extinction of traditional, thousand-year-old Native American civilizations. It also served as a dietary cultural exchange. Modern ubiquitous food, like cornbread, tomatoes, potatoes, chili peppers, cacao, beans, squash, and a lot more, were introduced to the first settlers by indigenous people. Meanwhile, the colonists exposed the natives to sheep, goats, cattle, pigs, peaches, apricots, plums, cherries, watermelons, melons, apples, grapes, wheat, and smallpox. And most of those items, especially sheep, remain staples to the present day. But the natives weren't the only factors influencing the colonists' culinary habits. In the 18th century, the colonial diet gradually changed as they tossed off the shackles of their benevolent British overlords and became more and more self-sufficient. Prior to the colonials officially declaring their traitorous intentions in 1776, they did their best to reproduce the crops and meat they'd enjoyed in the more civilized parts of the world. So they grew vegetables like turnips, onions, cabbage, carrots, and parsnips, and they hunted for game including deer, bear, buffalo, and turkey. And even when the settlers couldn't obtain familiar grub in the New World, they'd trade with Britain, continental Europe, and the West Indies to supplement their diets. Of course, once the colonists made one of the dumbest mistakes in human history and asserted their independence, their trade across the Atlantic dried up, at least for a spell. Hundreds of years later, the Americans would export their own culinary traditions, with McDonald's, Burger King, Taco Bell, and KFC, amongst others. And the world has been a happier place now that you can go to London, Paris, and Tokyo and get a Big Mac. In the 19th century, American food was heavily influenced by European immigrants and the emergence of soul food from the southern colonies and African Americans. Italians brought over sandwiches and spaghetti, Texas and Mexicans gave the US nachos and chili, Germans introduced hamburgers, sausages, pickles, pretzels, and lager, and while Chinese immigrants didn't initially serve the lo mein and egg rolls we're familiar with today, these visitors from the Far East did eventually develop a sort of quasi-ethnic cuisine for their new country. Meanwhile, African Americans produced modern staples like fried chicken, fried catfish, pork chops, collard greens, black-eyed peas, millet, okra, and yes, even watermelon. According to legend, ice cream came to America via Thomas Jefferson's enslaved chef James Hemings, who observed the frozen treat in France and brought that back to the colonies along with copper cookware, European-style mac and cheese, and French fries. Many of these so-called ethnic foods would eventually become the central pillars of fast food, with hamburgers, fried chicken, and French fries becoming three of the most prevalent items as cornerstones of cholesterol across the US and around the globe. Well done, America! You've conquered the world with trans fats and clogged arteries. Be sure to show your appreciation for my efforts with a like. And I shall return to educate the great unwashed masses and all those of good letters and breeding on the finer things in life and delightful cuisine.